You'll recall when we were looking at prepping characters for rigging, we talked for a while about this suit character and the shoulders, the issue with the shoulders. If you remember on the original artwork, both the suit man and the suit woman both have these very sharp angled shoulders. And we talked about how that was going to be difficult to get a smooth overlapping joint with. So what we ended up with was this, where we rounded the upper part of the arm and we overlapped it right up to the little angle there on the shoulder. So you no longer have a little angle, it just rounds out, and it's smooth and it works. But we did lose what was the real look of the character. Now I can tell you from experience that this particular kind of character design choice is very difficult to deal with when you're trying to create jointed characters, because it's very hard to get that little point to meet perfectly with any kind of range of motion. So Duik provides a tool that can make this kind of rigging quite a bit easier, although I still wouldn't say it was easy. This is still a very tricky kind of a situation to deal with. And quite frankly, a solution like this is the easiest and will also give you the greatest range of motion. But let's take a look at how we can solve this problem in a different way using Duik's Rotation Morph script. What this script allows us to do is similar to what the Morpher tool does. It'll take an animation and tie the progression of that animation, rather than to a slider, it ties it to a rotation value, which means you can have the arm morphing as it's rotating and have that morphing tied to a specific set of rotation values. So we've actually already got this partly set up, so let's go ahead and take a look at what we have here. Now before we look at the solution here, let's make sure we really understand the problem. I'm going to take this little bit of animation that I created here, move it off to the side, and we're just going to hold this value for a minute. Note first that I placed the anchor point for the upper arm right where that sharp shoulder corner is to help keep that point locked. Then note the shape of the upper arm sloping down at an angle from the anchor point. Now I've already done some tests, and this shape will work perfectly fine for the arm swinging forward. That's not really our problem. But when we swing the arm backwards, we start having trouble. You can see the problem we're having here already. We can see the edge of the upper arm, and it no longer looks properly attached to the torso. And the problem gets even worse if we reverse our IK orientation. Whoa, that's really bad. So that's severely limiting our range of motion there, obviously. Now the thing of it is, in order to solve this problem, we're going to need to take this point and stretch it way, way out and totally change the angle of the top of that arm. In fact, we're going to kind of lengthen it. Well, imagine if we have a big point sticking up here, what that's going to look like when we bring the arm down to here. Then you're going to have a big giant spike sticking up out of his shoulder, and that's not going to look very good either. So we need to have the arm in this shape in order to swing forward, but we need to have the arm change shape in order to swing backwards. And this is exactly what the Rotation Morph script is for. So let's go ahead and switch the IK orientation back to clockwise. And let's go ahead and return my animation of the arm path. So I've already created a simple little animation here so that as the arm raises, the shape of the arm changes. Now you can see that big spike sticking out there. Now in this particular case, it's not really necessary with the IK orientation like this. But let's remember, if we reverse that IK, then we really need that shape. Look at how that's just barely covering that space there. So we had to create a shape, and it took me a little time, that was going to work with both IK orientations with a pretty wide range of motion. And again, let's keep that checked for now. So creating the initial rotation morph is easy. The tricky part comes with getting it tuned. So before we go ahead and do this, let's take a look at the rotation value of this upper arm. We need to note the starting and ending rotation values of this layer for our two keyframes here, because this is the rotation that will drive our morpher. But there's a bit of a problem to consider because you get a slightly different set of values on the upper arm rotation depending on whether your IK orientation is checked on or off, clockwise or counterclockwise. When you run Duick's IK script, it seems to guess at the initial setting of the IK orientation, even though it isn't always what you want necessarily. And I think it's maybe based on the relative positions of the layers in the chain, but I fully admit that I don't know for sure. The math and scripting involved with Duick makes my brain hurt. But either way, it usually seems best to use the orientation values generated with the IK orientation set to the initial, we could say, default setting that was created by the IK script, which in this case is clockwise, even though this arm will likely be used for the most part with that checked for counterclockwise. But I can't say I've scientifically proven that to always work in every case. So I would say try that set of numbers first, the set of numbers generated with the orientation set as it was right after you ran the script. But if you can't get that to work, reverse the IK orientation and try that other set of rotation values instead. In this case, we're going to go ahead with the clockwise numbers since it was set clockwise after we ran the IK script. Right now, our first value is reading 0, but notice it's got a ×1 rotation in the value as well. You're going to get these kinds of slightly odd values with IK systems where it'll sometimes say -0, sometimes +0, sometimes 1 times 0. Sometimes it will read plus or -360, which is numerically the same as 1 rotation times 0 degrees. Honestly, it's really strange and unpredictable. Now when we enter these rotation values to complete our rotation morph, we may need to enter it as 1 rotation times 0 degrees, exactly as it is reading there on the layer. Or we may be able to just enter 0 degrees. You may have to try both to get this to work. Just like that IK orientation thing, the math here gets very complicated, so be prepared to try a couple different things in order to get this set up right. And this is part of the reason the rotation morph can be a bit tricky. Now I should say specifically that if you do not use an IK chain and just use an FK rig, the rotation morph is less tricky and easier to set up, but I'm assuming that 9 times out of 10 you're going to want to have the IK and the rotation morph. So basically our rotation value here is 0. And then our second rotation value here is plus 39.2 degrees. So we want to make note of those two numbers. Now to create our rotation morph, we just have to select the property we want to tie to that rotation and hit rotation morph. And now we're going to leave those two path keyframes there, but now those keyframes are no longer controlling the timing of that morph. The timing between those two keyframes is now going to be controlled by the rotation value of that layer. And you can see we've added a couple controllers here to this upper arm layer. And we've got a minimum angle, a maximum angle, and the reference layer which tells us which layer to be looking at for the rotation value. And you can change that to be any layer you wish. But in this case, we want it to be the same layer. Now we need to enter in our minimum and maximum values. I think we can get away with ignoring this one time here and just leave it at 0 and then type in the maximum value, 39.2. All right, now notice the little jump that occurred here. This is really common with rotation morphing with an IK chain. And this is the reason why it's trickier to use with IK. But we can usually solve this by noodling with the IK limit, which is added when we add our IK system to the root layer. So if we start to dial this back, whoops, look, it almost jumped back immediately. Let's try -1. That was enough to do that. Okay, notice how as I scrub through, it's morphing as we rotate. That's just what we want. But let's make sure that it actually works moving the arm forward, because sometimes it'll, whoops, see, we got another pop there. That's okay, we can usually fix this again by going back and continuing to adjust this value back. We'll keep taking this back. Oh, there it went. Okay, well, I want to find the exact point there. Minus 56. All right, let's see if we've got a fairly full range of motion now. Yeah, that looks great. Oh, still popping a little bit when we come up high like this. Let's see if we can pull that back just a little more. All right, now notice that when I went back that far, we're already too far. So we can't actually go any higher than that, although that actually doesn't look bad. Sort of works. But let's see if it's still working on the other end here. Yes, great. All right, look at that. Now, it still breaks when we go too far. So one of the things that's important to know about this is that you're going to have some limits to your range of motion. But that looks pretty good, and let's go ahead and change the IK orientation and check that. Yeah, looking great. So now we've got the look that we started with, the sharp shoulder. Again, it breaks when it gets a little too far there. Okay, we've got that happening. Oh, and by the way, we can delete these keyframes now. We don't need these. This is now simply part of the rig. Now keep in mind that the rotation morph will work with any kind of morphing animation. In this case, it was a shape layer path, but it could be a puppet tool animation or a mesh warp animation, almost anything that you can think of. So you can do this with raster art as well. Also, your animation can contain more than just 2 keyframes. It can have as many keyframes as you need it to, although be aware it can get trickier the more you try to push the range of motion and add keyframes. But it's a really useful tool and can be used to create things like muscles that flex when the arm bends and all kinds of really fun rigging tricks, and can be used to solve problems like the one we just looked at. Now check out the exercise video to see what we've got set up for you.